En við ætlum að fá heiðursgestin til okkar. Þetta Mónica Araya eins og Björt nefndi og ég ætla að kynna hana inn á ensku. Hún mun vera með sitt erindi á ensku og beini því til hennar. It's an honor to welcome Dr. Mónica Araya from Costa Rica as a keynote speaker at this conference. She is a founder and director of Costa Rica Limpia, a citizen initiative to promote fossil-free country with focus on renewable energy and clean mobility. She has worked on sustainability issues for over 20 years. Mónica holds a PhD on environmental science from Yale University and was a lead climate negotiator. She talks to the local and international media and is associated to several global initiatives. Her TED Talk about fossil-free Costa Rica has been viewed over 1 million times. In 2014, the French Ministry for Foreign Affairs nominated her as the person of the future. And in 2016, she was part of the world's largest all-female expedition to Antarctica. We are very happy to have you here, Mónica. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. It's really exciting to be here. I normally give presentations in rooms with people from very big countries. So it's a very special moment for me to be able to talk about this in a place with people from a small country, because as we will see in the presentation, it is very easy to take us for granted. I remember being in Brazil once, and you know, Brazil is a huge country. It's the largest economy in Latin America. And I was talking about things that were very important to me. And somebody said, well, except that, you know, Costa Rica is smaller than a neighborhood in Sao Paulo, I was told. So it is very easy to say, you know, what is the point of doing things in small countries? So one of the things I'm going to do this morning is to tell you why we actually have to do very big things, and we should be all working together. So we'll talk about this, and I hope this is helpful for you, because I know that in every country, no matter how big, how small, we go through very difficult conversations, and it's very important to have clarity and to be able to also look at things that are happening outside our own country so that we find ways of being better together. So it is extremely easy to feel very small in this world that likes big things. So if you just open any newspaper, the Financial Times, The Economist, it's all about being big, you know. It's about big investors. It's about big oil, whether they do this or they do that. It's always big, you know, usually in the headlines. Big technology players, what they do, what they are not gonna do anymore. The largest cities, you know, I go to a lot of conferences that deal with urban development, and it's always the big cities, you know, New York, Paris, you know, all the big Beijing conversations, in this case, Sao Paulo. And then, of course, if you track economics, it's usually all about the G20. And we never make it to these meetings, and I guess it's the same for Iceland. I guess when we get invited is to just be guests, but they are the big guys, right, and the big women. So if you also want to feel very small, you just have to look at the numbers, you know. Just those 20 countries represent 90% of the economy, 80% of global trade, 66% of global population. And then of course, it's also very easy to feel small when you look at the patterns of global emissions. You know, we barely show up in those maps. So one of the very important questions that we have to ask ourselves is, how do we matter in that kind of world? You know, how do we do things that are worth doing in a world that will say, well, what is the point? You know, even in Costa Rica, sometimes people say, well, we're not going to have an impact of global emissions, so why bother? And I think that is a very important question to answer, because it's not about the global emissions, it's about ourselves. It's about what we make of our countries, and it's not just about you know, whether the tiny bubble, which is Costa Rica, somewhere in the left side, in the orange, you don't really see it that much. The question is, you know, that it's not about how we impact the emissions, it's how we do the best choices in our country so that we live better. So we do need bold ideas, bold approaches, and arguably, it is easier to think bigger in our countries precisely because we're smaller. And also, I always hear things like, oh, you know, but if it's something that is happening in Sweden or Costa Rica, of course, you know, you guys are so good. So there is also the argument that, oh, you know, you know, if it works there, it's because you are already very good. And I think that you can turn it around and say, hey, wait a second. If these difficult things, decarbonization of the economy, resilience, you cannot make it succeed in a country like Costa Rica or Sweden or Iceland or Norway, well, try a more difficult country. You know, in a way, we need to show that these things are doable. So we have to think bold. We have to not let the small size of our territory limit our thinking. So what is the defining imperative that we're talking about? It's a complicated and complex discussion, but we can cluster it in two big clusters, or two big topics. Clearly, there are people who are working really hard on getting rid of fossil fuels. I count myself in that camp. I do want to, by the time I die, I do want to see a world that is less dependent on fossil fuels. So that conversation is mostly about emissions, about energy systems, infrastructure, transportation. And then there is the other side of the imperative, which is equally important. How do we build a more resilient society? How do we deal with these really, really damaging impacts of climate change? And I can tell you more about what happened this month in Costa Rica, which is the worst we have seen in our history. And one point I want to make about this imperative is that I am very skeptical of people who will try to create a competition of what is more important. It's a very damaging mindset to try to get into that fight. You know, it's about resilience, no, it's about decarbonization. We have to do both, and it doesn't mean the same person has to do both, but we have to have very robust communities around these two visions for our society. When it comes to the fossil-free economy and how to get rid of a lot of these emissions, clearly we have a lot of things going on for our generation that weren't there maybe 25 years ago. But renewables, you know, you have seen these trends. It's even hard to keep track of all the good news that you get in the newspapers around the costs of renewables going down. So, you know, I'm not going to dwell into that, but the point here is that technologies are helping us decarbonize our energy systems in ways that were unthinkable only 5 or 10 years ago. And if you look at this other graph, it goes in the opposite direction. You know, it goes from small to big, because for the first time in our history, we are actually talking about the end of the internal combustion engine. There are places that are setting deadlines. They are saying, you know, after this year, we will not sell any more gasoline and diesel cars. I never thought that 5 years ago, I never thought that I would be driving an all-electric car myself in Costa Rica. So this is going faster than we imagined, and this is also very helpful, especially for countries that already have clean electricity, like Iceland or Costa Rica or Norway. And the point here is that these trends, technologies, a lot of the things that are happening in China are happening regardless of us. So the point for smaller countries is not to be idea takers only, it's to be idea shapers. And we have to be able to say, what is it in this big world with big ideas and big players? What is it that we're going to do because it's coming from our own priorities and our own thinking? So when it comes to resilience, and I'm sure this is the same in Iceland, we are getting more and more evidence that things are getting very serious when it comes to impacts. So this is a very recent photograph from National Geographic. And the point here, if you look at the flag, this is happening in the US. There was a time maybe 10 years ago when all the visuals we had in our heads about vulnerability to climate impacts probably came from Bangladesh or a small or a poor developing country. Now this is happening in places like, Texas. And it's really shaking the system, even though sometimes we get the impression that very little is happening. So here we have a big opportunity for smaller countries to have big ideas and to ask ourselves, how can we be closer together? My husband is here, he's from Norway, and so we think a lot about these things. And one of the things we have discovered is that smaller countries don't cooperate. I mean, even Costa Rica and Norway, we don't even have embassies in each other's countries. Can you imagine? 2 countries of 5 million people don't bother to have embassies in each other's countries because we are all focused on, oh no, we have to do cooperation with China and the EU. And I think one of the key messages I want to leave on the table today is that it is up to us to cooperate because nobody's going to do it for us. So it's, I'm sure you like football. We do. It's scary, when you have to think about the World Cup. It's like, these are the big guys. They always win. They are always winning. So this photograph is, in my head at least, it summarizes how we feel when we look at these big games. Same thing with energy or technology. These are the big guys. And my point is that we just have to go for it. We just have to. So we are rooting for you. This came out in the newspaper the morning I was coming here. It was really, really exciting because I was just getting in the plane and they had the newspapers. And it's just a magical story, People are like, yeah, Iceland, we're going to be rooting for you. And I think to some extent, I mean, this is in the case of football, but it applies to other topics. When you hear a story about an entrepreneur in Iceland or an entrepreneur in Costa Rica, that makes it. The world tries to root for us because we can bring something else. By the way, we wish you all the best. We're also going to be in the World Cup, so I hope our teams get together and help each other. And this is a symbolic story, but I don't know if you follow football stories, but this is an amazing story. He's from Costa Rica, and he's now the goalkeeper of Real Madrid. You can imagine that in Latin American imagination, this is one of the top things that can happen, that you're the goalkeeper of such a big team. And this has been a very inspiring story for a lot of kids, also because he comes from a very humble background. So it's a story of also resilience, because he had a lot of things against him. So we don't set the rules, just like in football, but clearly we can do great things. So this is another example of smaller countries doing amazing things. You know the lady in the middle. You probably know her. She was the climate chief of the UNFCCC process, and I think Christiana, who is a very inspiring woman, has been a great inspiration for a lot of us, is a good example of what smaller countries can do in big environments. You know, this was a very complex negotiation. I was a negotiator myself. And it was exciting to see our country, the small country, being a bridge, because often, because we're small, it's even better to interact with the bigger players. And of course, when the Paris Agreement of climate change was born, it was also very empowering for a whole generation of Costa Rican activists and experts to see her there, sitting at the big table, you know, in the very moment where the Paris Agreement was being born. And so just very quickly, that's where we are in the middle of the Americas. So we also see ourselves as a bridge. I think it could apply to Iceland. You know, you are in the middle of two big continents. There are some differences in terms of the size of our countries, the population, our GDP, of course, and of course our CO2 emissions per capita. But the point here is to just summarize where we are. A lot of people think we are Puerto Rico, which is not the case. Puerto Rico is an island, and it's a different story. Something very interesting about our countries is that our top three sources of energy for electricity are the same: hydro, geothermal, and wind. We have one national power utility. In our case, it was born in 48. In your case, 65. It was amazing. You know, when I came yesterday, the sign that you show at the airport, you know, celebrating the land of renewable energy is very similar to the one we have at our own airport. You say to the public outside Iceland to come because it's nature paradise. We have exactly the same narrative. It's very striking. We both have extraordinary national parks. You know, even if you are from the same country, you can't stop being amazed by the beauty and the luck that we have to have, you know, to have these around our cities. Also, it's quite interesting that the whole thing with the hot spring culture is very embedded in both countries. It's a lot of joy that you get from having this, but you also have the other side of things, which is to pay the price of having volcanoes. So the one you see on the right side is something that happened last year in our country. So I can tell you a lot of stories of how that had a lot of impacts in our everyday life. So the point here is that, and I'm sure this is the same for you and other Nordic countries, but the choices that we have made, the choice of being clean, or at least cleaner than other countries, has paid off. If you look at what we did, the sequences that we have had, it's very clear to me as a person who was born after those things happened that it was very important for people from the previous generation to be bold. You know, when they said, we are going to get rid of the army in this country, they did not say, we're going to get rid of a little bit of the army, just a tiny, tiny little bit of the army. No, they went for it, and they got rid of it. When they invested in health and education, they went for it. And of course, that has translated into high levels of social progress, which have benefited my generation for decisions that were made a lot of years ago. So look at this. If you look at the Social Progress Index, which it measures every country in terms of how much GDP is translated into social progress, and you look at the health and wellness level that we have achieved, Iceland and Costa Rica have exactly the same level of health and wellness, even though our GDP is lower. And the US, which has a GDP level per capita much higher than our country, has lower levels of health and wellness. So the point here is that we have been, or several generations have been very efficient at turning GDP into good things, even though the GDP level is low. You can also look at this other thing we have done, which is to invest in national parks in the 70s, which was pretty bold at the time. That helped us develop a system of payments for ecosystem services in the 90s, which at the time was very innovative. And then by the time the 2000s came, it was very easy, or not easy, but it was easy to envision the country as a destination for ecotourism, which created a lot of opportunities. And that led to a very bold, again, bold is the word here, a very bold decision about 17 years ago, which was to set a moratorium on oil exploration and exploitation. So right now, you cannot drill. You cannot go there and try to look for oil. Of course, there are people who want to get rid of this moratorium. And their argument is, why not? Why not do oil? Why not? Everybody else is doing it. So some of us are saying, well, we just don't want to be like the other countries. Thank you. You know? But it's part of this conversation. There are tensions. I don't want to give you the impression that it's all easy and it's always, you know, easy to agree. Some people really disagree with some of these bold decisions. So in terms of why we also have to protect this, 0.03% of the territory contains 6% of the world's biodiversity. We have 26 national parks, 25% of the landmass is protected, and some part of the fuel tax goes into environmental protection. So again, we have done these two things really well. We are in this third sequence here, because since the 50s, we have invested in renewable energy, our own sources. There was a lot of pressure in the 70s to do coal, and I'm so grateful to the people in the 70s who said, no, why would we use coal? Let's use hydro. Now we need to diversify away from hydro. But the point is that several decades later, we were able to claim that our electricity is renewable. And as you know, that creates a lot of opportunities for differentiation. So the next step, and that is the bold step, is that, you know, these are our sources of electricity, water, heat from volcanoes, wind, solar, and biomass. But the top three are water, heat, and wind. You can get the percentages there. The point here is that it makes a lot of sense to do what? If we have all that electricity, it makes a lot of sense to go and think big about electric mobility. Again, not just like with the Army, not a little bit of electric mobility, a few cars there and a few buses. No, think big and say, we can be the first country who gets rid of petroleum, who gets rid of this internal combustion engine era. So, of course, it is not just that I would like to do this. We have a very serious target in terms of the Paris Agreement. In fact, there is analysis that show that only 5 countries in the world have Paris targets that are adequate. So we are one of them. And the vision for the country, I mean, if you were Costa Ricans, and you're sitting here and I'm talking about this, I'm not going to tell you that we have to do this because there is a Paris Agreement. Of course, we have to meet the targets because that's what serious countries do. You don't sign something and walk away. The point is different. The point is that we have to do it because it's good for us. Imagine, this is Costa Rica around 6 p.m. We live not very far from the stadium. So at 6 p.m., you would be coming home and everything will be electrified. Because our lives are pretty much electric already. The only thing we don't electrify is our cars because we're still stuck with the gasoline cars. But the point is to help people visualize that one day everything will be electric, everything, from your computer, from your phone to your car. And that's part of the work I do with people. You know, try to imagine that it is possible, that we don't have to wait for the bigger countries to do it first. So this is the question that we're struggling with. Why should we continue importing fossil fuels if we can use our clean electricity? And again, this is not about the global emissions and whether we can change that global map of you know, that terrible pattern of global emissions. This is good for us, it's smart, it's the right thing for us to do. And there are some developments. I'm not going to go into all the details, but we are doing things. There is a law proposal. There are some basic incentives. There is already some infrastructure, but remember, you know, most of these cars will be charged at home. 92% of the homes in Costa Rica have garages, so that's where we charge our car. There are electric bus testing. There is a proposal for an electric train, and of course, the state has to buy a lot of things. So this is already happening, and of course there is a pushback because that is the whole thing. Humans resist change. It doesn't matter whether it's Iceland or Costa Rica. There is a resistance to doing things differently. This is the talk that has helped a lot in telling the story of our country trying to get rid of fossil fuels. It's very important to tell stories. So if you work on this, tell a story, help people understand why they have to be part of this. This is an example of some of the work we do with people, translating this into language that is accessible to non-experts. We do a lot of Facebook Live events so that people can watch from their homes. This is an example of electric bus testing. A lot of work that I want to do more and more is with kids, because I think just as the previous generation had a profound impact on some of us, I actually think we have to give back and work with the next generation. And then this is an example, like this Bjorn, who's sitting here, that's in a rural community. It's very important to also talk to people outside the cities. Otherwise, their ability to be part of this will be constrained if we don't involve them. You can't really see this in this picture, but it was packed. This happened like 6 weeks ago in a rural community who wants to they want to know how to be part of this bigger, this bigger conversation. And a person who works there in electricity, it was very touching. He came afterwards and said to me, hey, every time I talk to my wife, I tell her that I feel very proud of being part of this thing, because I know it's not about Costa Rica, it's about a bigger thing out there. This is an example of what we try to do in positive terms. It's a study of how to electrify transportation in Costa Rica. Bjorn and I work a lot together, so it has a lot of insights from Norway. And then just to start closing, this happened in my country a few weeks ago. Actually, it was October 5th and 6th, so it's even within this month. I'm sure you have cried when you have been sad about things that really, when you can't have words for this. This was a school, a high school on top. It had been built in 2013 with a lot of pride from the community. It was a beautiful, beautiful high school, and this is what happened in October. It's gone. Like, they have tried to save it, but it's a story of what will continue happening. And I don't want to sound a fatalist, because I don't like to victimize our country. We'd never do that in Costa Rica. So this is not about saying, oh, we're victims and the world has to do something for us. No, it's the opposite. This is happening. We have to be clear about it. What can we do that is smart, that is long-term oriented? I'll give you another example. This is us. This is my mom in the red jacket. That was on a Sunday. And then by Thursday, this is what happened in the same community. 4 days afterwards, we were speechless, because we never encountered this level of aggressivity. When you look at the picture on the left, this is the road that gets you to this park. It was impossible to get there or to get out. So some tourists were so desperate, some Brazilians paid for a helicopter because they couldn't get out by road. So working together is not going to be the whole answer to this, but it's part of the answer. And I really think our countries will have to figure out how to deal with this, because I've been reading a lot coming here about your country, and you are vulnerable too. Clearly, I'm not an expert on glaciers, but I have seen the pictures in some of the articles, and I'm sure some people here in the audience are probably thinking about how to deal with these impacts. So yes, so we have to find ways to come up with good ideas for our countries in both sides of this big equation. As I said, going back to your point about having nature paradise in Iceland, and we too having one, I think one critical sector for us to look at is ecotourism, because it's such a source of opportunity for local business. It's such a good story, and we have to think about how this sector can be a pioneer for resilience and decarbonization. I think ecotourism can do both really well. It fits really nicely because it's about ecotourism 2.2, ecotourism post-Paris, ecotourism in the age of clean transportation in the age of resilience. How can we be the smartest countries doing ecotourism that is fit for purpose? And the example I give you from Costa Rica is that, think about it. We attract all these people to come to our country to look at places like the one in the right. And all these people, of them go to these beautiful parks in gasoline cars with big, big exhaust pipes. It doesn't make sense. It really doesn't make sense, and especially in a country that has clean electricity. So the point of the visual here is that perhaps this is an opportunity also for Iceland to become, how do we become the prime destinations for tourists that just want to do fossil-free terrestrial transportation? So one of the things that we did in the study, we'll give one to the minister, it's in English, is to map and to help visualize what it's like. For example, if you have Norwegians switching to electric cars or people in California, and I have switched already, you don't want to drive gasoline cars ever again. So of course you have to be able to think about places where you could do that kind of tourism. And Norway is doing something, I think, is another small country that we need to bring into this conversation, And then because the natural capital is at risk, the one that we are so proud of, I think there is also something about our identity. It's not just about technology or climate change. It's not about just, meeting the Paris targets, as I said before. It's also about who we are as people. This is part of who we are. And we have to, one of the important things when dealing with this is so easy to get desperate and to get negative and to get toxic. So one of the things that we have to do really well with the public is to switch from all the conversation about loss and damage and talk about what we love. So we love this stuff. We love this. We know that this is important to us, so we protect it because it's important to us, not just because of the bad things. And again, going back to tourism, these headlines that you get, and I don't read Icelandic, obviously, so I don't know what is being discussed in your newspapers in Icelandic. But even if you Google in English, you start looking at this narrative of things that are under risk. So we have to be able to go and say to the public, it is bad, but here is some light. Here are some things we can do. So let me conclude by saying that we have many things that are different, starting from the language. I couldn't understand anything I tried. But that doesn't matter, because we can speak our own, we can find ways of working together. We're very peaceful countries, we're stable, we have our problems, I know. We're not perfect, and that is the other thing. Very quickly, people point at our countries and say, oh, but you're not as perfect. Look, this is so wrong, and this is so wrong. That's not the point. It's not about perfection. It's about being bold, because we have the capacity and the commitment to being bold. So why not do it? So let's create something together. That is why I'm here, and I'm very excited. And I hope you come to Costa Rica. Some of you, we'll welcome you there. And in the meantime, thank you so much for having me and taking the time to listen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mónica, for a very interesting, encouraging talk. We had no idea that we were so close, that Iceland and Costa Rica has so much in common. What you're saying basically is small is not weak. Small is big if you have a vision. We have a few minutes if you want to ask Mónica about something around her issues. There will be microphones here around somewhere. If someone has a question, it's over there at the end.
Hi, my name is Hildur Knútsdóttir. I wanted, Mónica was talking about the carbon tax that the 3.5% goes to environmental issues. I wanted to ask, how high is your carbon tax, and do you think it's working?
Sure. It's very low for now because it was set that was in the 90s. So it was 3.5. What happened was that there was a lot of deforestation in the 90s, in the 80s and the early 90s. And a group of people said, we have to stop this, and we're going to do something that is controversial, but we have to do it because it's the only way. So they went and talked to the people who were cutting the trees because they were doing a lot of meat production, and they said, would you stop cutting trees if we pay you to stop them, to stop this madness? And then basically created this system called the payment for environmental services. So these farms had to show that by not cutting the trees, they were preserving some vital ecosystem services, and somebody had to pay for that. The Minister of Finance at the time was very, very skeptical of this idea. And they said, well, we can fund it somehow with our own resources, and they put this tax, which at the time was 3.5% of gasoline. So that went into a fund, and that fund had money to pay these farms. And they actually stopped cutting trees. It was a very successful story at the time, but the money was not enough. So we actually had to borrow money from the World Bank to actually have enough to pay for this system. It has been criticized because, in a way, it reverses the principle of, of the polluting company being the one who pays. But in the case of Costa Rica, it worked because in the end you won a lot of allies, and it is one of the stories that is helping us in this time when we have to think about new ideas. The story of the deforestation reversal has been very helpful because it's about coming up with our own solutions in order to tackle some of the big questions. But I guess the person who asked the question, I could not see you. I guess what you're referring to in terms of a carbon tax is something bigger, and it is a conversation that we have to have because it is, I think, one of the most difficult questions that we're struggling with in Costa Rica right now is that many people say we cannot possibly get off fossil fuels because we tax them. And that money goes into a fund that repairs roads. Therefore, we have to continue importing fossil fuels, which is, this is the kind of thinking that we have to break, but we have to offer a solution. And one of the new frontiers for us in Costa Rica is precisely to deal with taxes, then to transform taxes so that we don't depend on fossil fuels because of the taxes we collect on them for roads. And I think that is, if you have ideas on this, we would really welcome them. If there are people here that work on green taxes, I think that is one of the most important things for emerging economies, because our tax system actually doesn't help us make the transition.
Hello, my name is Auður Ingolsdóttir from the Icelandic Tourism Research Center. Thank you for an excellent talk. I was very impressed. And I was, of course, also very, very happy to see how you were linking it to this tourist sector, because that's a big issue for us here, and I don't think we have linked it to the climate question, not on the mitigation or the adaptation side. One thing, my question relates to, because you're talking about the electrical cars and how we should move there. Another issue strongly related to tourism and greenhouse gas emissions, and in particular for us being an island, is international flights. So I just wanted to see if you have any thoughts on that, because, how can we work on that issue?
Yeah, I think the question of the infrastructure I suppose the question for you is how to build the infrastructure for tourism. But I think in terms of our countries, one of the biggest assets we have is precisely our size. If you are trying to do this in India or in Brazil, this is difficult because of the scale of their territory. But in our case, several things are working for us. First, the length that tourists would have to drive is not impossible. We have learned this from Norway. You know, for example, we have driven in Norway 700 kilometers in an electric car in one day. So what you need is to have a good system of charging points that are fast, you know, fast chargers. You have to have a good app where you can plan your trip and put the location, and then you find you will find the charging points. It's very important to work a lot with existing restaurants. You know, one of the biggest lessons from Norway is that you don't want to put a charging point in the middle of nowhere, because it's kind of boring for now to stop for 20 minutes and charge your car for 80% of the battery. But if you have a restaurant, if you have a system, an ecosystem around it, then it's a very good thing for the restaurants too. And the other thing that is very encouraging is that there are already efforts, for example, in Arizona and in Portland, where you have electric routes. And this is something we've been thinking a lot in Costa Rica. You know, if there are tourists that are coming to Costa Rica because of our clean electricity, and they want to see the 5 sources of electricity, you can actually see it in a place that is no longer than 50 kilometers. You can see hydro, geothermal, solar, wind. So that kind of route, eventually you have to be able to create a story around it, to create a map, to create a map and an app. And you have to be able, for example, in the case of Costa Rica, the estimate from Björn's study is that what we need for the fast chargers is around $13 to $15 million. So it's not $100 million. So one of the things that you could do in Iceland is to do that. Maybe it's already done. You know, I don't know enough about tourism and electric mobility in Iceland, but one of the big things that you could do is to do that kind of mapping, to start asking yourself, where would people go in order to see Iceland and get a story about electricity in Iceland and get a story about, you know, coming together. I think the other question that you asked is one for which we don't have answers yet, which is the impact of aviation. And I think there are great developments in terms of the solar impulse, you know, the flight that was done through solar energy, but I think we're still a little far from fossil-free air travel. So I think what we could do instead of waiting for this to happen is to say, given that aviation is still based on fossil fuels, the very least we could do is to make sure that the terrestrial side of our trips to these beautiful locations is done through electricity. So I actually think that Iceland, on this Saturday we'll test it, because this Saturday we want to experience how easy it is to rent a car here that runs only on electricity made in Iceland, whether there is an app, whether there is a, you know, so I'll be happy to report back how it goes and give you feedback. So, yes. Yes. Thank you. My phone is here.
Your phone. Thank you, Mónica. Thank you again. Við þurfum að